October 27th, 1962. The height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet submarine B-59 has been detected by the US Navy, and the Americans are now dropping depth charges left and right of them. And in an astonishing move, Captain Valentin Savitsky orders the use of B-59's single nuclear-tipped torpedo. What happens next will determine the fate of humanity. It all starts with this guy, Fidel Castro. The formation of Castro's Communist Party with his anti-American standpoint and attacks on US interests within Cuba led to President John F. Kennedy authorizing the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. 1,400 Cuban exiles armed with American weapons would attempt to storm the shores of Cuba and act as a precursor for the uprising of Castro's opposers in an attempt to oust his Communist Party. However, oversights in the planning of the invasion would lead to its spectacular failure and leave Castro convinced that a full-scale American invasion of Cuba was undoubtedly to follow. This pushed Castro to strengthen his ties with the Soviet Union, who were rather nervous themselves due to recent US missile placements within Italy and Turkey, which left Ukraine and parts of Russia well within striking distance. With only a handful of intercontinental missiles in their arsenal at the time, this left the Soviets at a massive disadvantage in the case of nuclear war with the US. And so the Kremlin formulated a plan to secretly place Soviet missiles inside Cuba, a mere 90 miles off the shores of Florida. Okay, so this is where this geopolitical game of chess between America and the Soviet Union escalates really quickly and becomes extremely dangerous. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographs these Soviet missile sites being constructed within Cuba.
But now further action is required, and it is underway, and these actions may only be the beginning.
In response, the US would set up a blockade around the island nation to prevent any further Soviet ships entering Cuba. To say things were tense at this point is a pretty massive understatement, but things were only about to get worse. On October 1st, 2 weeks before the discovery of the missile placements, 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel subs had departed their base in Kola Bay with the intention of establishing a base in Cuba. But now, due to the blockade, they were lurking in the Caribbean awaiting further orders, and each of the subs carried on board a single nuclear-tipped torpedo with roughly the destructive capacity of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And although they had no combat orders, they were, however, authorized to retaliate in any means necessary if they came under attack, provided that both the captain and the political officer agreed on the use of the nuclear weapon. On the night of October 27th, when captain of B-59 Valentin Savitsky ordered his sub to surface, he was greeted by a very unpleasant surprise. American anti-submarine ships and planes had been tracking B-59 for days, and the planes were now doing flybys just 30 meters above the sub, while the destroyers cut dangerously close in front of him. All the while, over 300 warning shots from automatic cannons were fired. But what is said to have really unsettled Savitsky was the depth charges pitched left and right of him. Now, these were only dummy charges, but I am sure to the exhausted captain, this all seemed very real. Now, these actions from the US Navy seem very provocative, but bear in mind they had no idea that these subs were nuclear armed, and earlier that day, a US spy plane had been shot down over Cuba, and to add even more fuel to the fire, telegrams from Fidel Castro to the Kremlin had been intercepted, in which Castro urged the Soviet Union to make a preemptive nuclear strike on US soil. Witness accounts from the crew of B-59 state that the depth charges infuriated Savitsky, and he ordered an urgent dive and the readying of torpedo tube number 1, which contained the nuclear-tipped torpedo. Savitsky is quoted as saying, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all." He also had the support of his political officer, and under normal circumstances, this was all that was needed for the launching of the nuclear weapon. But as chance would have it, there was a third officer on board B-59 that day. Vasily Arkhipov just so happened to be the flotilla commander responsible for all 4 subs sent to Cuba, and also the only man with the power to veto the decision to use the nuclear weapon. Arkhipov disagreed with Savitsky and insisted that the Americans were simply signaling them to surface and identify themselves. He argued that although the warning shots and depth charges were unsettling, they were always left or right of them and never on target. Eventually, he managed to calm Savitsky down, and the order to fire was never relayed to the torpedo commander. B-59 would eventually about face and head back to Moscow. If Savitsky had his way on that fateful night, the US would have undoubtedly retaliated with a nuclear strike of their own. It is terrifying to think that the world that we know it, and quite possibly even the survival of mankind, can come down to a game of chance. Vasily Arkhipov could have chosen to board any of the 4 subs sent to Cuba, but thankfully on the day that has come to be known as the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he just so happened to be on board B-59.